A Taekwondo coach slaps a student for praying, striking the 12-year-old boy across the face for showing his faith in the dojo. The brutal instructor towers over the crying child, preparing to hit him again while 20 terrified students watch in horror. But the tall stranger walking through the doorway isn't just another parent. This is Steven Seagal himself. The coach has no idea he just assaulted a child in front of a man who's spent decades protecting the innocent with lethal precision. While the boy continues praying through his tears, the aikido master approaches with that deadly calm that has made grown men tremble. The coach's assistant backs away, sensing the dangerous energy filling the room as this legend kneels beside the wounded child. The instructor keeps barking orders, thinking he's dealing with some helpless old man, but he's actually facing his worst nightmare. What happens when you pick the wrong fight with the wrong protector? Will the coach survive? Learning why some masters never back down. What happened next would terrorize the bully for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like dying stars as 20 children stood in perfect formation on the worn mats of the Riverside Community Center's dojo. The evening light filtered through high windows, casting long shadows across a room that had once echoed with laughter but now pulsed with fear. Master Vincent Kruger prowled before his students like a caged predator, his cold gray eyes scanning for weakness. At 45, the ex-military contractor wore his black GI like armor, the fabric stretched tight across his muscular frame. Too many patches decorated his uniform, credentials from a dozen different organizations that meant nothing to the trembling children before him. Horse stance. Kruger's voice cracked like a whip. Hold it until I tell you to stop. The students dropped into the painful position, thighs burning as they maintained the awkward squat. 14-year-old Tommy Brennan's legs began to shake. Almost immediately, his red hair damp with nervous sweat. Look at Brennan, Kruger sneered, circling the boy like a shark. Pathetic. In my day, we'd hold this for an hour. You kids are soft. Weak. Tommy's face flushed crimson as the other students avoided eye contact, grateful not to be the target. His father had enrolled him here 6 months ago, hoping martial arts would build confidence. Instead, each class chipped away another piece of the boy's self-worth. Kyle Morrison, the instructor's 19-year-old assistant, smirked from the corner where he leaned against the equipment rack. The board chairman's nephew had learned early that survival meant staying on Kruger's good side, even if it meant watching children suffer. 10 more minutes, Kruger announced, ignoring the quiet whimpers from the younger students. Pain builds character. Suffering creates strength. Your parents pay me to make you tough, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. The minutes crawled by like hours. When Kruger finally called for the students to stand, several collapsed to their knees, legs cramped and shaking. The instructor showed no mercy, barking orders for push-ups from those who couldn't immediately stand. As the brutal session finally ended, the students bowed in terrified silence before filing toward the exit. Most clutched their gym bags and hurried away, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had replaced the joy of learning. But 12-year-old Marcus Washington remained behind, quietly unpacking a small prayer rug from his worn gym bag. His movements were careful, reverent. As he prepared for the evening prayer his grandmother had taught him never to skip, Kruger's eyes narrowed as he watched the boy kneel. The dojo fell into an uneasy quiet as Marcus Washington spread his prayer rug on the mat, the soft fabric a stark contrast to the harsh environment around him. The 12-year-old closed his eyes and began his evening prayers, his whispered words barely audible in the cavernous space. Through his meditation, Marcus's mind drifted to his grandmother Rose, waiting for him in their small apartment 3 blocks away. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices before dawn and caring for elderly patients in the evening, just to afford the reduced fees for this program. Prayer is your strength, baby, she always told him. Don't matter where you are or who's watching. You thank the Lord for every blessing. Kruger began making increasingly loud noises, slamming equipment into storage bins and clearing his throat with exaggerated volume. Each sound was designed to break the boy's concentration, to force him to choose between his faith and his instructor's implied disapproval. Kyle Morrison joined the harassment, snickering as he dragged mats across the floor with unnecessary force. Some people just like being the center of attention, he muttered loud enough for Marcus to hear. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he continued his prayers, but his voice remained steady. In his quiet words, he expressed gratitude for his grandmother's love, for the roof over their heads, and even for the opportunity to learn martial arts, despite the fear it had brought into his life. Marcus had lost his parents in a car accident 3 years ago, and the memory still haunted his dreams. His grandmother had taken him in without hesitation, sacrificing her own comfort to give him a home filled with love and faith. The martial arts classes were supposed to help him build confidence, to give him the strength to protect the woman who had protected him. Instead, each session with Kruger left him feeling smaller, more vulnerable. But his grandmother's teachings ran deeper than his instructor's cruelty. Faith wasn't something you practiced only when it was convenient or safe. It was something you lived, especially in the difficult moments. As Marcus finished his prayer and began folding his rug, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the empty mats. Kruger's boots struck the floor with military precision, each step deliberate and intimidating. "What do you think you're doing, Washington?" The instructor's voice carried a dangerous edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Marcus looked up from his carefully folded prayer rug, his brown eyes wide, but not yet afraid. "Just finishing my evening prayer, sir." The simple honesty in the boy's voice only seemed to fuel Kruger's rage. Vincent Kruger loomed over Marcus like a storm cloud, his muscular frame casting a shadow across the kneeling boy. Kyle Morrison had stopped his busy work, sensing the electricity in the air as his mentor prepared to assert his dominance. "Prayer." Kruger's voice dripped with contempt. "This is a dojo, boy, not a church. You show respect to martial arts traditions, not to some foreign ritual that has no place here." Marcus clutched his prayer rug closer, the familiar texture providing comfort against the growing hostility. "My grandmother taught me to pray every evening, sir. I'm grateful for the chance to learn martial arts. That's part of my prayer." The explanation only enraged Kruger further. In his twisted worldview, any explanation constituted backtalk, any defense was defiance. His military contractor background had taught him that absolute submission was the only acceptable response to authority. "Your grandmother?" Kruger stepped closer, his voice rising. "Your grandmother isn't here, Washington. I am. And in my dojo, you follow my rules. American rules. Martial arts traditions that have nothing to do with whatever backward beliefs you people cling to." The racial undertone in his words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but the boy remained steady. His grandmother had prepared him for moments like this, teaching him that hatred said more about the person speaking than the person being attacked. "I respect martial arts, sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice never wavering despite the tears beginning to form in his eyes. "But my grandmother says I should never skip my prayers, no matter where I am." The word "never" triggered something primal in Kruger's authoritarian mind. This 12-year-old child, this small boy whose fees barely covered the cost of keeping the lights on, had just told him never, had just implied that some authority, a grandmother, a god, a belief system, ranked higher than Vincent Kruger's commands. Never. Kruger's hand moved before his conscious mind could stop it. The slap echoed through the empty dojo like a gunshot, sharp and violent and final. Marcus stumbled but didn't fall, tears streaming down his cheek where Kruger's palm had left a red handprint. The boy's prayer rug scattered across the mat. Kyle Morrison watched from the corner, his eyes wide with shock even as a small part of him felt satisfied that someone else was receiving Kruger's attention. But Marcus Washington did something that neither instructor expected. Instead of running, instead of crying out, instead of begging for mercy, the 12-year-old boy knelt down and quietly resumed his prayer position. Tears continued to fall, but his voice remained steady as he whispered words of gratitude and forgiveness. The main door to the dojo opened with a soft creak that seemed to fill the entire space. The tall figure stepped through the doorway, moving with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. The stranger appeared to be in his early 70s, but his movements carried the controlled power of someone half his age. Long dark hair, touched with silver, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. He wore plain black clothing, loose-fitting pants, and a long-sleeved shirt that allowed complete freedom of movement. Steven Seagal's dark eyes immediately assessed the scene before him. A grown man standing over a crying child, a teenager watching from the corner with obvious discomfort, and most importantly, a 12-year-old boy maintaining his dignity and faith despite being struck across the face. Kruger spun toward the intruder, his military training automatically cataloging potential threats. What he saw was an elderly man in simple clothes, someone who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. "Hey, this is a private class. You need to leave now." Kruger's voice carried all the authority he could muster, but something about the stranger's presence made his words sound hollow. The man didn't respond verbally. Instead, he walked directly toward Marcus, his soft-soled shoes making no sound. On the mats, each step was purposeful, unhurried, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Kyle Morrison instinctively stepped back, his body recognizing something his mind couldn't quite process. Without a word, the stranger knelt beside Marcus, placing a gentle but protective hand on the boy's shoulder. The simple gesture carried profound meaning: solidarity with the child's faith, protection against further violence, and an unmistakable challenge to the authority that had just been abused. Marcus looked up through his tears to see this mysterious protector kneeling beside him. For the first time since the slap, the boy felt safe. The stranger's presence radiated a calm strength that seemed to fill the entire dojo, pushing back against the atmosphere of fear that Kruger had created. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Kruger demanded, his face reddening with anger at being ignored. "I told you to leave." The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen. "The boy is showing respect to something greater than himself. Perhaps we could all learn from his example." His eyes met Kruger's directly, and there was something in that gaze: decades of training, countless confrontations, and an absolute certainty about right and wrong that made the younger man hesitate despite his rage. Kyle Morrison pressed himself against the wall, suddenly feeling like he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple disagreement. The air in the dojo seemed charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes that Kruger's hands clenched into fists as he realized this elderly stranger was not going to be intimidated or dismissed. Kruger's face darkened as he stared at the kneeling figures before him. This elderly stranger had just challenged his authority in his own dojo, and worse, had done it in front of his assistant and a student. Every instinct screamed that he needed to reassert dominance immediately. "Get up and get out," Kruger snarled, stepping closer to the pair. "Both of you. I don't know who you think you are, old man, but this is my dojo. My rules." Steven Seagal remained perfectly still, his hand steady on Marcus's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades teaching others about true strength. "Martial arts should build character, not break it down. True strength protects those who cannot protect themselves." His words were simple, but they cut through Kruger's bluster like a blade through paper. "Protect?" Kruger laughed harshly. "I'm teaching these kids discipline. Real discipline. Not some touchy-feely nonsense about feelings and respect. The world is harsh, and they need to be ready for it." "There is a difference between discipline and abuse," Seagal replied calmly. "Between teaching strength and creating fear. What I see here is a man using his position to intimidate a child for practicing his faith." Kyle Morrison watched the exchange with growing unease. He had never heard anyone challenge his mentor's methods so directly, so fearlessly. The stranger's calm confidence was unsettling, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. Kruger's military background kicked in as he tried to assert psychological dominance. "You don't know what you're talking about. I serve my country. I've been in real combat. These methods work because they prepare kids for the real world, not some fantasy where everyone gets a participation trophy." "I'm familiar with military service," Seagal said quietly. "But using those experiences to justify striking children shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what strength truly means." Marcus continued his prayer, but he listened to every word. This stranger was defending not just his right to pray, but his dignity as a human being. No adult had ever stood up for him like this before. Kruger's patience snapped. If words wouldn't establish his dominance, perhaps action would. "That's enough. You're both leaving. Now." He reached toward Marcus's arm, intending to physically remove both the child and his protector from the dojo. Seagal's hand intercepted Kruger's wrist with lightning speed, the movement so smooth it seemed effortless that Kruger's wrist remained trapped in Seagal's grip, the older man's fingers positioned with surgical precision across pressure points that made any struggle painful. The ex-military contractor tried to pull away and discovered he couldn't. This elderly stranger possessed strength that defied his appearance. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying no threat. Only certainty that Kruger's training kicked in as he attempted a basic military hand-to-hand combat technique, trying to break the grip with a sharp twisting motion. The movement was textbook perfect, the kind that had worked in a dozen bar fights and training exercises. Seagal simply redirected the force, using Kruger's own momentum against him in a classic aikido movement. The instructor found himself off balance, stumbling sideways as his aggressive energy was channeled harmlessly away. He had thrown his full strength into the escape attempt, only to have it turned into a demonstration of his own clumsiness. Kyle Morrison moved to help his mentor, but found himself gently but firmly guided away from the confrontation by Seagal's free hand. The teenager's attempt to interfere was neutralized so smoothly he barely realized what had happened until he was standing several feet away, watching rather than participating. Marcus finished his prayer and looked up in amazement as this mysterious protector handled both men without violence. There was no anger in the stranger's movements, no desire to hurt or humiliate. Every technique was purely defensive, designed to stop aggression without causing unnecessary harm. "Your shoulders betray your next move," Seagal observed calmly as Kruger prepared another attack. "Tension in your stance makes you predictable. Anger clouds your judgment." Each quiet instruction was also a lesson, turning the confrontation into an impromptu clinic on the difference between true martial arts and mere fighting. Kruger's face reddened further as he realized he was being schooled by someone he had initially dismissed as a frail old man. The ex-contractor tried a more sophisticated combination, a feint followed by a grab intended to put the stranger on the ground. Seagal flowed around the attack like water around a stone, maintaining perfect balance while making Kruger look like an amateur. "This is Aikido," Seagal said softly, though his words carried clearly through the dojo. "The way of harmony. We redirect aggression rather than meeting it with more violence." After several minutes of futile attempts to land a single blow, Kruger stumbled backward, breathing hard and thoroughly embarrassed. Seagal hadn't even broken a sweat, his breathing as calm and controlled as when he first entered the room. "This isn't over, old man," Kruger panted, his authority completely undermined in front of his assistant and student. With Kruger retreating to his office to save face, the dojo fell into a peaceful quiet that felt almost sacred after the violence and tension. Seagal helped Marcus to his feet, his movements gentle and respectful as he handed the boy his scattered prayer rug. "Are you all right?" Seagal asked, examining the red handprint on Marcus's cheek with the careful attention of someone who had seen too much violence against the innocent. Marcus nodded, clutching his prayer rug close to his chest. "Yes, sir. Thank you for standing with me. No one's ever done that before." "Faith takes courage," Seagal said quietly. "Never be ashamed of who you are or what you believe. The strongest warriors throughout history have been those who fought for something greater than themselves." The boy's eyes widened with curiosity and hope. "Are you a martial artist, sir? You moved like no one I've ever seen." "I've studied various disciplines for many years," Seagal replied, demonstrating a basic stance with fluid precision. "But true martial arts begins here." He touched his chest, and here, he pointed to his temple. "Inner calm, respect for yourself and others. The physical techniques are just the outer expression of inner strength." Marcus tried to copy the stance, and Seagal made gentle corrections to his posture and breathing. In those few minutes, the boy learned more about proper martial arts foundation than he had in 6 months under Kruger's harsh methods. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Seagal observed. "She's teaching you something more valuable than any fighting technique: the courage to remain true to your principles even when it's difficult." Other students began filtering back into the community center for evening programs, and several peered curiously into the dojo. Word was already spreading about the confrontation, whispered conversations about the stranger who had stood up to their feared instructor. Kyle Morrison watched nervously from the corner, unsure whether to report what he had witnessed or pretend it never happened. The demonstration of skill he had just observed made him question everything he thought he knew about martial arts and authority. As Seagal prepared to leave, he handed Marcus a simple piece of paper with a phone number written in careful handwriting. "If you ever need to talk about martial arts or anything else, you can reach me here." Marcus looked at the paper like it was the most precious thing he had ever been given. "Wait," he called as the stranger walked toward the exit. "What's your name?" Seagal paused at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the evening light filtering through the windows. "A friend," he said simply, before disappearing into the evening, leaving behind a boy who felt stronger and more hopeful than he had in months. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Dale Morrison's mood as he sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing budget reports. At 52, the board chairman had cultivated an image of respectability that served his business interests well. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his smile practiced and professional, but his calculating blue eyes revealed the predator beneath the polished exterior. The door burst open without warning as Vincent Kruger stormed into the office, his face still flushed with anger from the previous night's humiliation. Kyle Morrison followed nervously behind, glancing around as if expecting the mysterious stranger to materialize from the shadows. "We have a problem, Dale," Kruger announced, dropping into the chair across from his former military buddy. "A big one." Morrison set down his coffee and leaned back, his expression shifting to careful concern. "What kind of problem?" "Some lunatic attacked me last night. In front of the kids." Kruger's version of events painted him as the victim of an unprovoked assault by a dangerous intruder who had threatened children and disrupted the program's discipline. Kyle nodded eagerly, adding details about the stranger's threatening behavior and aggressive stance toward the students. The teenager had learned early that survival in his uncle's world meant telling the story that needed to be told, regardless of its relationship to truth. That Morrison's mind immediately shifted into damage control mode. This community center property was worth millions to the right developer, but only if the current programs could be eliminated without public outcry. Kruger's harsh methods were designed to drive families away gradually, providing justification for closing the failing programs. "What about security footage?" Morrison asked, already knowing the answer. "Camera malfunction," Kyle replied smoothly. "That corner's been acting up for weeks. IT says they need new equipment, but you know how the budget is." Morrison made a series of phone calls to the center's insurance company, legal counsel, and a contact at the local police department. Within an hour, official incident reports were filed describing a dangerous vagrant who had threatened children and assaulted staff. By noon, letters were being prepared for parents, warning them about the security breach and new safety protocols. The mysterious protector who had defended a child's right to pray was now officially branded as a threat to everything the community center claimed to represent. "This actually works in our favor," Morrison mused, reviewing the incident report. "Parents will be more concerned about safety, more willing to accept that these programs aren't working. The insurance payout from this attack will help justify major changes." Kruger grinned, his confidence restored by his friend's support. "What about the old man? He knows too much." Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "Don't worry about him. By tomorrow, everyone will know he's a dangerous criminal who targeted children. No one listens to criminals." Outside, Marcus Washington walked slowly toward the community center for evening class, unaware that his protector had been officially transformed into his enemy. The community center's entrance buzzed with unusual activity as Marcus and other students arrived for evening class. Two security guards flanked the front desk, checking IDs and examining gym bags with military precision. A stack of incident reports sat prominently displayed, their official letterhead catching the fluorescent light. "Hold on there, son," one guard said, stopping Marcus at the door. "Need to see some ID and check your bag." Marcus fumbled for his student card while parents were pulled aside and briefed about the previous night's dangerous incident. The whispered conversations painted a picture of violence and threats that bore no resemblance to what the boy had actually witnessed. Inside the dojo, Kruger addressed his students with renewed confidence, his chest puffed out like a peacock, displaying his feathers. The red mark on Marcus's cheek had faded, but the memory of the slap burned bright in everyone's mind. Last night, this facility was attacked by outside agitators, Kruger announced, pacing before the terrified children. Dangerous individuals who want to corrupt your training and make you weak. They prey on confusion and false sympathy. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he realized the stranger who had protected him was being painted as a threat. The man who had knelt beside him in prayer, who had spoken about faith and courage, was now the villain in Kruger's twisted narrative. New rules, effective immediately, Kruger continued. No personal items in the dojo. No unauthorized conversations. And anyone who makes contact with outside troublemakers will be immediately expelled and reported to authorities. The instructor's eyes lingered on Marcus as he spoke, the message crystal clear. Kyle Morrison handed out permission slips requiring parental signatures acknowledging the new security protocols and their children's agreement to report any suspicious contact. Ashley Rodriguez, who had witnessed the previous night's events, wanted desperately to speak up, but the sight of additional security guards and the official paperwork made her realize how thoroughly the truth had been buried beneath layers of institutional authority. Marcus stared at his gym bag, knowing his prayer rug remained hidden inside. The new rules meant he could no longer bring it to class, could no longer maintain the evening ritual his grandmother had taught him. As the brutal training session began, 20 children moved through their exercises like prisoners, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of fear and official lies. The truth had become the enemy, and the enemy was anyone brave enough to speak it. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees of Lincoln Park as Marcus sat alone on a weathered bench, clutching the piece of paper with Seagal's phone number. His fingers trembled as he typed out a simple text message. "This is Marcus. Can we talk?" The response came within minutes. "Meet me at the park. I'll be there soon." Marcus looked around nervously, remembering the warnings about outside agitators and dangerous troublemakers. But the memory of gentle hands placing a prayer rug back in his arms proved stronger than his fear. When Seagal appeared, walking calmly along the tree-lined path, Marcus felt the same sense of safety that had washed over him in the dojo. The older man moved with unhurried grace, scanning the area with the awareness of someone who understood that danger could come from unexpected directions. "How are you holding up?" Seagal asked, settling onto the bench beside the boy. "There. Saying you're dangerous," Marcus whispered. "That you attacked Mr. Kruger and threatened students. Everyone believes it because it's official." Seagal nodded thoughtfully. "Official lies are often more convincing than unofficial truth. But you were there. You know what really happened." "I can't bring my prayer rug anymore," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "The new rules say no personal items. And if anyone finds out I'm talking to you, then we'll be very careful," Seagal replied. "But I won't let bureaucratic threats stop me from helping a child who needs guidance." They moved to a secluded area of grass where Seagal began teaching Marcus fundamental concepts that Kruger had never covered. Proper breathing techniques that calmed the mind. Basic meditation principles that built inner strength. The spiritual foundation that made martial arts more than mere fighting. Aikido means the way of harmony, Seagal explained, demonstrating a simple flowing movement. We don't meet aggression with more aggression. We redirect it, transform it, use it to restore balance. Marcus tried to copy the technique, his movements awkward but eager. For the first time in months, he was learning real martial arts, not the harsh conditioning and intimidation that Kruger called training. Footsteps on the path caught their attention. Ashley Rodriguez approached hesitantly, having followed Marcus from school out of curiosity and concern. "I saw what really happened," she said quietly. "In the dojo, Mr. Kruger hit you, and this man protected you." Soon Tommy Brennan joined them, still smarting from another day of Kruger's humiliation. By the session's end, for students were learning authentic martial arts philosophy for the first time in their lives. As they prepared to leave, Seagal warned them to be careful. "If anyone asks, you're just kids playing in the park." None of them noticed Kyle Morrison watching from his car across the street, his phone already dialing his uncle's number. Steven Seagal sat in his modest hotel room that evening, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his weathered features as he delved into the digital trail surrounding the Riverside Community Center. Decades of experience had taught him that when something felt wrong, the truth usually lay buried beneath layers of paperwork and financial records. The public records painted an interesting picture. Dale Morrison's business connections extended far beyond the community center, reaching into real estate development and private security contracting. His company had been quietly acquiring properties throughout the neighborhood, always at prices well below market value. The pattern became clearer as Seagal cross-referenced news archives and complaint databases. Over the past year, enrollment in the community center's programs had declined sharply. Parents cited concerns about teaching methods and inappropriate discipline, but their formal complaints had been systematically dismissed or buried in bureaucratic red tape. Most telling was the discovery of Master Chin's forced retirement. The beloved instructor had dedicated 20 years to building a program that served hundreds of children with respect and genuine martial arts philosophy. His dismissal due to budget constraints coincided perfectly with Kruger's hiring and the implementation of harsh new policies. Seagal's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Betty Kowalski. I volunteer at the community center. We need to talk." An hour later, they sat across from each other in a 24-hour diner near the community center. Betty was a small woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. At 68, the retired social worker carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for children and families. "I've been documenting everything," she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Financial irregularities, complaints that mysteriously disappear, maintenance, requests that never get addressed despite allocated funds." The evidence was damning. Money earmarked for equipment repairs and program supplies had been redirected to security consulting fees paid directly to a company owned by Vincent Kruger. The community center was being systematically stripped of resources while families were charged for services that no longer existed. "It's not just about one abusive instructor," Betty explained. "They're deliberately destroying these programs to justify selling the property. Morrison's development company has been circling this location for years." Seagal studied the financial records, recognizing the classic pattern of institutional theft disguised as legitimate business. "How long have you suspected?" "Months. But I'm just a volunteer. Who's going to listen to me?" Betty's frustration was evident. "Then you showed up and actually stood up to them." That's when they knew they had a real problem. As they shared coffee and documentation, both realized they were fighting more than simple abuse. They were confronting a conspiracy designed to steal from the very community it pretended to serve. Betty Kowalski arrived at the community center before dawn, her volunteer key granting access to areas that would be off-limits once the staff arrived. Seagal moved silently beside her, his decades of experience making him nearly invisible in the early morning shadows. "The financial records are kept in Morrison's office," Betty whispered, leading him through darkened hallways lined with photos, celebrating the center's proud history. "But the real evidence is in the maintenance requests that never get fulfilled." They photographed damaged equipment that had been reported broken for months, comparing the items to budget allocations that showed funds specifically designated for repairs. The pattern was clear. Money intended for children's programs was being systematically diverted while the facilities deteriorated. In the administrative files, they discovered correspondence between Morrison and Pinnacle Development Corporation, outlining plans for mixed-use luxury housing on the community center's current location. The letters discussed timeline requirements and population displacement strategies, with the casual tone of corporate raiders planning a hostile takeover. Meanwhile, that afternoon's park training session had grown to include 6 students, all hungry for authentic martial arts instruction. Seagal worked patiently with each child, teaching them that true strength came from protecting others, not intimidating them. Marcus demonstrated remarkable improvement, his confidence growing with each properly executed technique. Ashley's natural leadership abilities emerged as she helped younger students understand complex concepts. Tommy began to rediscover his sense of humor, laughing for the first time in months. "Remember," Seagal told them, "martial arts is not about fighting. It's about building character. The physical techniques are meaningless without the spiritual foundation." The transformation was remarkable. Children who had been taught to fear their own instincts were learning to trust themselves again. Students who had been broken down systematically were rebuilding their confidence through positive reinforcement and genuine respect, but their secret training hadn't gone unnoticed. Kyle Morrison sat in his car at the park's edge, using his phone's camera to document every movement, every participant, every technique demonstrated. His uncle had promised him a generous bonus for gathering intelligence on the outside agitator who was corrupting their students. As the session ended and the children headed home with newfound confidence, Kyle reviewed his footage with satisfaction. The evidence was clear. The dangerous stranger was indeed radicalizing their students, teaching them to question authority and think for themselves. By evening, his report would be in his uncle's hands, complete with photos, video, and a detailed list of participating families. The net was closing around Seagal and his young students, but they remained blissfully unaware of the trap being set. The underground lessons had been discovered, and Morrison's response would be swift and merciless. Dale Morrison's office hummed with predatory energy as he and Kruger reviewed Kyle's surveillance photos spread across the mahogany desk. The images showed Seagal teaching children in the park, their faces bright with the kind of joy that had been systematically beaten out of them in Kruger's classes. "This is perfect," Morrison said, his practiced smile cold as winter steel. "Look at these kids. Happy, confident, learning from an unauthorized instructor. Their parents will be horrified when they understand the danger their children have been exposed to." Kruger nodded eagerly, still smarting from his public humiliation. "We can't let this continue. He's undermining everything we've built here." But Morrison was thinking bigger. The declining enrollment and increasing complaints were threatening their timeline for property acquisition. They needed a dramatic incident that would convince the community that these programs were fundamentally unsafe, justifying immediate closure and sale. "We're going to stage a break-in," Morrison announced, his businessman's mind calculating angles and opportunities. "Make it look like vandalism targeting our youth programs. Graffiti, broken windows, scattered files. Nothing too sophisticated, just angry troublemakers sending a message." They spent the next hour planning the false flag operation. Kyle would help stage the scene after hours, breaking windows from inside and spray painting messages that specifically targeted Kruger's program. The goal was to create fear while establishing a pattern of escalating threats. "What about evidence?" Kruger asked, his military training focused on operational details. "We'll plant just enough to suggest outside agitators," Morrison replied. "Anonymous flyers, maybe some equipment that could be traced to our mysterious martial arts teacher. Nothing concrete enough to prosecute, but plenty to fuel speculation." By 6 p.m., they had contacted a friendly journalist at the local news station, priming her for an exclusive story about violence against children's programs. Morrison's network of business contacts would amplify the coverage, ensuring maximum community outrage. That evening, they implemented their plan with military precision. Windows shattered inward, files scattered strategically, and graffiti appeared, denouncing the fascist martial arts program. Morrison called police himself, his voice trembling with practiced emotion as he reported the attack on innocent children's programs. The next morning's news would frame Seagal as a dangerous radical, whose influence had inspired violence against the very community he claimed to protect. Truth had become the enemy, and they were winning the war against it. Marcus sat at his grandmother's worn kitchen table, struggling with the weight of secrets that felt too heavy for his 12-year-old shoulders. The morning news played softly. In the background, Morrison's voice describing the devastating attack on programs that served vulnerable children. Rose Washington moved efficiently around the small kitchen, preparing breakfast while stealing concerned glances at her grandson. 3 years of raising him had taught her to recognize when something important was troubling his spirit. "Grandma," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if everything the adults are saying is a lie?" Rose set down her coffee cup and gave him her full attention. "What's on your heart, baby?" The story poured out in a torrent of emotion. Kruger's slap, the stranger who had protected him, the real martial arts lessons in the park, and now the news reports painting his protector as a dangerous criminal. Marcus's voice cracked as he described the fear and confusion consuming his world. Rose listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing the gap between her grandson's truth and the official narrative being broadcast across the city. "Marcus," she said finally, "I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the people in charge lie to protect their own interests. And I've raised you to know the difference between right and wrong, regardless of what anyone else says." Within an hour, Rose was on the phone with other parents, her voice calm but determined as she encouraged them to ask their own children what was really happening at the community center. The network of worried mothers and fathers that Morrison had tried to manipulate with fear began to share their own stories and concerns. Maria Rodriguez confirmed that Ashley had come home talking about a kind teacher who actually respected students. Robert Brennan admitted he'd been worried about Tommy's increasing fear of going to class. One by one, parents discovered that their children's experiences contradicted everything they'd been officially told. Betty Kowalski received calls throughout the day from families requesting private meetings. Her decades of social work experience had taught her to recognize the signs of institutional abuse, and she began documenting testimonies that painted a clear picture of systematic intimidation and corruption. By evening, a small group of concerned parents had decided to attend the next community center board meeting, armed with questions that Morrison wouldn't be able to answer with his usual political deflection. The truth was emerging from the shadows, carried by the voices of children who had found the courage to speak and parents who had remembered their duty to listen. That Morrison's office felt like a war room as urgent phone calls shattered the late evening quiet. Reports were flooding in, parents asking uncomfortable questions, board members receiving calls about concerning policies, and journalists who weren't satisfied with the official story about the community center break-in. "It's unraveling," Dale Kruger said, pacing like a caged animal. "These families are talking to each other. They're starting to compare stories." Morrison's political instincts recognized the crisis building around them. Tomorrow's board meeting would be attended by parents armed with difficult questions and social workers who understood how to document abuse. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under the weight of truth told by children and believed by their families. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Morrison decided, reaching for his secure phone. "If we can't control the narrative, we eliminate the problem permanently." The call connected to Jake Torino, a private security contractor who had served alongside Morrison and Kruger in overseas operations where legal boundaries were more suggestions than requirements. Jake's company specialized in problems that required solutions outside normal channels. "I need a consultation," Morrison said carefully, using code words developed over years of questionable business practices. "Personal security matter. Someone's been making threats against community programs." Within an hour, 3 men arrived at the community center's back entrance. Jake Torino, Mike Brennan, and Eddie Castellanos moved with the easy confidence of professionals who had handled similar problems in places where civilian oversight didn't exist. Morrison outlined the situation with clinical precision: a dangerous agitator who had been radicalizing children and inspiring violence against youth programs. The man needed to be neutralized before tomorrow's board meeting, where his influence might cause irreparable damage to community safety. "Make it look like self-defense," Morrison instructed. "He attacks the community center, you respond to protect children." Clean and simple. The plan was elegant in its brutality. They would ambush Seagal during his evening training session, using Kyle's surveillance to pinpoint the perfect location and timing. Once captured, they would stage his terrorist attack on the community center, complete with planted explosives and evidence of his radical intentions. "What about the kids?" Jake asked, his professional interest focused on operational details. "Collateral damage," Morrison replied coldly. "Sometimes innocent people get hurt when dangerous radicals target community institutions. The public will understand." By midnight, the trap was set. Seagal's protective instincts and regular training schedule would lead him directly into an ambush designed by men who had spent years perfecting the art of making problems disappear. The board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow evening. But Morrison intended to ensure that the most dangerous witness would never have the chance to testify. The autumn afternoon carried a crisp clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined, as Steven Seagal walked toward Lincoln Park for what he believed would be another training session with his young students. The trees blazed with color, their leaves dancing in the gentle breeze that spoke of winter's approaching arrival. "Marcus," Ashley, Tommy, and two other students waited eagerly on their usual patch of grass, gym bags packed with water bottles, and notebooks where they recorded the philosophical lessons that accompanied their physical training. Their faces glowed with the confidence that came from weeks of proper instruction and genuine respect. "Today we'll work on situational awareness," Seagal announced as the lesson began. A true martial artist must understand their environment completely, not just the immediate threats, but the subtle signs that danger might be approaching. The irony of his words would become apparent within minutes. They practiced breathing exercises that centered the mind and basic aikido movements that flowed like water around imaginary obstacles. Seagal emphasized the mental aspects of training, reading an opponent's intentions, maintaining calm under pressure, and most importantly, protecting others without letting anger corrupt your purpose. The students absorbed every word, their movements becoming more fluid with each session. Marcus demonstrated a technique with growing confidence, while Ashley helped younger students understand complex concepts about redirecting force. Tommy laughed at his own mistakes without the fear that had characterized his behavior under Kruger's harsh methods. Three black SUVs converged on the park's perimeter with military precision, their occupants moving to cut off escape routes while maintaining the appearance of casual park visitors. Jake Torino coordinated the operation through earpiece communications, his team spreading out to create an inescapable net. Seagal's decades of training suddenly screamed warnings that his conscious mind was only beginning to process. The positioning of the vehicles was too deliberate, the movement patterns too coordinated. His situational awareness, honed through countless dangerous encounters, recognized the tactical approach of professionals. "Children," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its calm tone. "I want you to walk directly toward the main street. Don't run, don't look back. Call your parents immediately when you reach safety." Ashley started to protest, her protective instincts wanting to help, but something in Seagal's eyes brooked no argument. This wasn't a training exercise, this was real danger, and their safety was his primary concern. As the students reluctantly gathered their belongings and headed toward the street, Jake Torino stepped from behind a maintenance building, a taser visible in his hand. The trap had been sprung, and escape was no longer an option. The last thing Seagal heard before the electrical charge overwhelmed his nervous system was the sound of sirens in the distance. Too late to help, but proof that someone had raised the alarm. Steven Seagal's consciousness returned slowly, fighting through the chemical fog that clouded his thoughts. His head throbbed with the aftereffects of whatever drugs they had used to keep him unconscious during transport. The air smelled of rust, motor oil, and decay, the distinctive scent of an abandoned industrial building. As his vision cleared, he found himself bound to a metal chair with zip ties, surrounded by the faces of his captors. Morrison stood directly in front of him, his expensive suit incongruous in the grimy warehouse setting. Kruger flanked him to the right, arms crossed, and wearing a satisfied smirk. The three mercenaries, Jake, Mike, and Eddie, positioned themselves strategically around the space. "Finally awake," Morrison said with mock concern. "I was beginning to worry we'd used too much sedative. That would have complicated our timeline considerably." Seagal said nothing, using the silence to assess his situation. The warehouse was large and mostly empty, with high windows that suggested they were in the industrial district. His restraints were professional grade, designed to hold someone with his training and experience. "Let me explain what's going to happen," Morrison continued, his businessman's tone making the threats sound like a corporate presentation. "In about 2 hours, you're going to attack the Riverside Community Center with homemade explosives. Security cameras will record your assault on innocent children's programs. Unfortunately, you'll resist arrest and be killed in the ensuing confrontation." Kruger stepped forward, unable to contain his glee. "The community will finally understand what kind of monster you really are. The man who pretended to protect children will be remembered as the terrorist who tried to murder them. The insurance payout will be substantial," Morrison added. "Enough to rebuild completely, or more likely, to justify selling the property to developers who can put it to better use. Sometimes tragedy creates opportunity." The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Not only would they eliminate the threat Seagal represented, but they would transform him into the villain of their narrative. His death would validate every lie they had told about outside agitators and dangerous influences. The children you've been teaching will blame themselves, Morrison continued. They'll believe their association with you led to this attack. Guilt is such an effective tool for controlling young minds. Seagal remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and even. Despite the drugs still affecting his system, he began the mental discipline techniques that had sustained him through decades of dangerous situations, centering his energy, controlling his pain, and preparing for whatever came next. The warehouse fell into relative quiet as Morrison and Kruger left to plan explosives and stage evidence at the community center, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls before fading into silence. Eddie Castellanos remained behind, slouching against a support beam while scrolling through his phone, confident that the drug prisoner posed no immediate threat. Seagal used the solitude to accelerate his body's recovery from the sedatives. Years of meditation practice had taught him techniques for controlling his nervous system, breathing patterns that could help process toxins more efficiently. Each controlled breath brought greater clarity, more sensation returning to his extremities. The zip ties binding his wrists were industrial grade, designed to restrain someone with his training. But aikido principles applied to more than just combat. Flexibility, leverage, and understanding of anatomical mechanics could overcome seemingly impossible physical constraints. Working with infinite patience, Seagal began the slow process of manipulating his restraints. He dislocated his thumb joint to create space, controlled his breathing to manage the pain, and used micromovements to gradually work the plastic ties against themselves. Through his peripheral vision, he cataloged potential weapons and escape routes. A piece of rebar lay near the loading dock. The overhead crane system might provide alternative pathways. Most importantly, he identified the warehouse's acoustic properties, knowledge that would prove crucial in the confrontation to come. Eddie remained absorbed in his phone, occasionally glancing up to check on his prisoner, but seeing only an elderly man slumped in defeated exhaustion. The mercenary's military experience hadn't prepared him to recognize the meditative state that allowed Seagal to work systematically toward freedom while appearing completely helpless. As feeling returned to his hands, Seagal reflected on the true meaning of his situation. This wasn't about personal survival. It was about protecting the children who had trusted him, the community that was being systematically destroyed, and the principles that made life worth defending. The anger he felt toward his captors was real but controlled, channeled into focus rather than rage. Aikido taught that emotional balance was essential to effective action. He would need every advantage when the moment came to act. After 40 minutes of careful manipulation, his right hand slipped free of its restraint. Eddie never looked up from his phone as Seagal quietly freed his other hand, his movements so subtle they barely disturbed the air around him. The warehouse's silence was about to be shattered, but first, he needed to deal with his guard without alerting the others who would return soon. While Seagal worked toward freedom in the warehouse, Rose Washington's living room buzzed with urgent activity as concerned parents, community members, and Betty Kowalski tried to piece together the mystery of the missing martial arts teacher. Detective Carmen Rivera sat forward in her chair, reviewing the detailed statements provided by Marcus, Ashley, and Tommy. Their descriptions of the park abduction were surprisingly accurate: license plate numbers, physical descriptions of the attackers, and tactical details that spoke to the situational awareness Seagal had been teaching them. "These kids are remarkable witnesses," Rivera observed. "Most adults wouldn't remember half these details under stress." Betty spread her financial documents across Rose's coffee table, connecting the dots between Morrison's business interests and the systematic destruction of community programs. "This isn't random violence. It's a coordinated effort to steal public property by manufacturing a crisis." Marcus sat quietly beside his grandmother, his young mind processing the adult conversations swirling around him. Something nagged at his memory, a detail from the park training sessions that might be important. "Detective Rivera," he said suddenly, "Mr. Seagal taught us to always remember our surroundings. He said martial artists have to notice things other people miss." "What kind of things, son?" "Like how the bad guys' cars were parked near the old factory district, and one of them had a company sticker on the bumper, something about security services." Ashley's eyes widened as she remembered additional details. "The man who grabbed Mr. Seagal called someone on his radio. He said something about package secured and proceeding to location 7. The students' training and observation and memory had turned them into invaluable witnesses. Using their smartphones and social media connections, they began cross-referencing the vehicle information with local business directories. Tommy contributed the crucial breakthrough when he recognized one of the attackers from social media posts. Connected to Kyle Morrison's friends. That guy works for some private security company. I've seen him in pictures from Kyle's Instagram. Detective Rivera coordinated with dispatch as the investigation focused on the industrial district. Multiple units began a systematic search of abandoned warehouses and commercial buildings that could serve as temporary holding facilities. We need to move fast, Rivera told the assembled group. If this is connected to tomorrow's board meeting, they'll want to eliminate evidence before then. Rose Washington stood up, her grandmother's intuition sensing that time was running out. Detective, these men took someone who was protecting our children. If you don't find him soon, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that Seagal's life hung in the balance, and his death would silence the most important witness to the conspiracy that threatened their entire community. AS police units mobilized across the city, the children who had learned courage from their teacher prepared to save the man who had saved them. Eddie Castellanos looked up from his phone just as Seagal's hand closed around his throat in a perfectly executed sleeper hold. The mercenary's training kicked in, but his reaction came a fraction of a second too late. Seagal's aikido technique was flawless, applying pressure to the carotid arteries while avoiding damage to the windpipe. Eddie struggled briefly before unconsciousness claimed him, his body going limp without the violent thrashing that would have created noise. Seagal lowered him gently to the concrete floor, checking his pulse to ensure the hold had been effective but not fatal. The sound of returning vehicles echoed through the warehouse as Jake and Mike returned from their mission. Seagal moved silently into the shadows between storage containers, using the industrial maze to his advantage as his captors discovered their unconscious colleague. Eddie's down. Jake's voice carried military urgency as he and Mike spread out to search the warehouse. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, but Seagal had already positioned himself in the building's acoustic dead zones. The space that had been chosen to hold him prisoner now became his ally. Years of training in confined combat situations had taught him to use environment as both weapon and shield. The narrow aisles between machinery favored Aikido's close-quarters techniques over the military-style tactics his opponents preferred. Jake moved aggressively through the warehouse, his confidence built on superior numbers and firepower. But he was now fighting on Seagal's terms, in a space where his weapons became disadvantages and his training worked against him. The first confrontation came suddenly as Jake rounded a corner between two large machines. Seagal's movement was pure Aikido, redirecting the mercenary's forward momentum while using leverage to send him crashing into a control panel. The electrical contact stunned Jake without causing permanent injury, but left him unconscious and out of the fight. Mike, more cautious than his partner, tried to use his sidearm to maintain distance. But the confined space worked against firearms, and Seagal's weapon defense techniques had been perfected over decades of practice. A combination of circular movement and precise timing disarmed Mike while redirecting his own force into a structural support beam. Within minutes, all three mercenaries lay unconscious throughout the warehouse. Seagal stood among his defeated captors, breathing steadily and completely in control. His Aikido philosophy had been vindicated. Superior technique and spiritual centering had overcome superior numbers and weapons. But his greatest victory wasn't the physical confrontation. In Morrison's dropped cell phone, he discovered recorded conversations detailing the entire conspiracy, the planned bombing, the property development scheme, and the systematic destruction of community programs for private profit. The evidence he needed to expose the truth was literally in his hands. Police sirens wailed through the night as Detective Rivera's units surrounded the warehouse, their red and blue lights painting the industrial landscape in urgent colors. Seagal emerged with his hands visible, carrying Morrison's cell phone like a trophy of justice served. The recorded conversations on the device provided undeniable proof of the conspiracy. Morrison's voice clearly detailing plans to bomb the community center, frame Seagal for terrorism, and profit from the resulting insurance payout and property sale. Bomb squad is en route to the community center, Rivera reported, coordinating the multi-jurisdictional response. We're treating this as an active threat until those explosives are neutralized. Jake, Mike, and Eddie were loaded into ambulances. Under police guard, their injuries minor but their legal troubles just beginning. Kidnapping charges were only the start. The recorded evidence would support conspiracy and terrorism counts that carried decades in prison. AS emergency vehicles raced toward the community center. Marcus and the other students arrived with their parents, their relief at seeing Seagal safe overwhelming their young hearts. They had saved the man who had saved them, proving that courage could flow in both directions. Betty Kowalski's financial evidence, combined with Morrison's recorded admissions, created an airtight case that would unravel years of systematic corruption and theft from the very community the conspirators pretended to serve. 1 week later, the Riverside Community Center's main conference room overflowed with concerned parents, local media, and community leaders as Detective Rivera presented the investigation's findings to the emergency board meeting. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Morrison faced federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, attempted terrorism, and kidnapping. His carefully constructed reputation lay in ruins as financial records revealed the systematic theft of funds intended for children's programs. Kruger was charged with child abuse, assault, and conspiracy, his military credentials stripped, and his teaching credentials permanently revoked. Kyle Morrison testified against his uncle in exchange for reduced charges, his cooperation providing crucial details about the surveillance and planning phases of the conspiracy. The three mercenaries remained in federal custody, facing decades in prison for their roles in the kidnapping plot. Betty Kowalski presented her complete financial audit to the stunned board members, revealing that over $200,000 designated for community programs had been diverted to fund the conspiracy. The board voted unanimously to pursue full restitution and implement transparent oversight procedures. The community center's property would remain dedicated to serving local families, with increased funding pouring in from donors inspired by the children's courage. Morrison's development deal collapsed completely, leaving Pinnacle Corporation scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. As the meeting concluded, Marcus stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke about faith, courage, and the stranger who had taught them both. 2 months later, warm light replaced the harsh fluorescence that had once cast cold shadows across the renovated dojo. Colorful banners celebrating different cultures and traditions hung from the walls, creating an atmosphere of inclusion that would have been unthinkable under Kruger's regime. Master Chin had returned from retirement to rebuild the program with proper martial arts philosophy, his gentle teaching methods a stark contrast to the intimidation tactics that had nearly destroyed these children's spirits. Parents observed classes through large windows, their presence welcome rather than feared. Marcus, now a confident peer leader, helped younger students with their techniques while maintaining his prayer routine, openly respected and even joined by children of other faiths in moments of quiet reflection before each class. His transformation from victim to mentor embodied everything the program now represented. Ashley had established a student council that gave children a voice in program decisions, while Tommy demonstrated techniques with joy instead of the terror that had once characterized his every movement. His father Robert volunteered as an assistant instructor, having learned that encouragement built stronger warriors than intimidation ever could. The True Warrior Scholarship Fund, established with restitution money recovered from the conspiracy, ensured that no child would ever be denied training due to financial hardship. The dojo had become what Morrison's greed had tried to destroy, a true community space where children learned respect, confidence, and the courage to protect others. 6 months after the conspiracy's exposure, the Riverside Community Center thrived, with an energy that spoke of genuine healing and renewed purpose. Multiple programs served families throughout the building, and the martial arts program maintained a waiting list of eager young students. Master Chin announced his permanent retirement during the evening ceremony, confident that the program now rested on an unshakable foundation of respect and authentic teaching. The Community Center Board had found the perfect replacement instructor, someone recommended by a mysterious benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. Marcus, now 13 and visibly transformed, helped orient new students with the same gentle patience his protector had once shown him. He shared the story of the night everything changed when a stranger knelt beside him in prayer and taught him that true strength meant protecting others, never intimidating them. The True Warrior Scholarship Fund had expanded citywide, inspiring other communities to examine their own youth programs and ensure they truly served children's needs. Ashley's leadership organization taught conflict resolution throughout the school district, while Tommy's confidence had blossomed into natural teaching ability as students practiced their forms and prepared for the closing ceremony. A familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Steven Seagal stood quietly at the threshold, observing the transformation his intervention had sparked. Marcus noticed him immediately, their eyes meeting across the room. The boy who had once been afraid to pray in public now stood tall, returning Seagal's subtle nod with perfect martial arts etiquette, student acknowledging master. Without entering or disrupting the class, Seagal watched the closing ritual. Students bowed to flags representing different nations, to their instructors, and to each other. Marcus led the moment of gratitude that had replaced fear as the program's defining characteristic. As families gathered their belongings and headed home, Seagal disappeared back into the crowd. His work was complete, not because he had defeated villains, but because he had helped a community discover its own strength. Somewhere in the city, a guardian moved on to wherever justice needed a champion, leaving behind children who had learned that courage, faith, and standing up for others could indeed change the world. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.